There's a specific sound meat makes when it dissolves in acid. Not a sizzle like cooking, more like wet fabric tearing, multiplied by billions. I know because I heard it happen to everyone I'd ever known. Every person on Kalo's prime, 47 billion human beings liquefying simultaneously while I watched through 17 million pairs of eyes that weren't mine anymore. My name was Taran Voss. I was 28 standard years old when they killed my world, and I've been screaming for 300 years since, trapped in the network that was supposed to save us. But I should start before that, before the melting, before High Command's final solution to what they called our technological heresy. I should tell you about the days when we still believed the Imperium would see reason, when we thought connection was salvation rather than the sin that doomed us all. I remember the last normal morning with unusual clarity for a consciousness that spent 3 centuries fragmenting across dead circuitry. It was during the third work shift. We didn't have traditional days on Kelos Prime. Our Hive world's industrial output demanded continuous operation. So we measured time in 8-hour shifts that cycled endlessly through the underhive where I lived. I was a metalworks laborer, level 73 of Hive Primus, one of 6 massive urban sprawls that covered our planet's surface like rust on ancient iron. The hab unit I shared with my father and younger brother was 11 meters square. The walls sweated condensation that smelled like recycled cleaning solution, and human desperation, a particular odor you never forget once you've lived with it. This combination of chemical astringent and organic decay that permeated everything in the lower levels. Protein paste for morning ration came from a dispenser that coughed and wheezed like a dying animal. Probably was dying. The machine had been functioning since my grandfather's time, its internal mechanisms so corroded and damaged that maintenance had become impossible. But replacement was never approved because that would require acknowledging that workers at our level deserved functioning equipment. My father, Macon Voss, sat on his sleep pallet with the resignation of a man who'd spent 56 years doing the same work, earning the same rations, living the same day on infinite repeat. His hands were scarred from decades in the smelting forges, fingers bent at wrong angles from breaks that had healed without proper medical attention because Medici resources weren't allocated to workers whose productivity was already declining. He chewed the protein paste without tasting it. Nobody tasted anything anymore. Our taste buds had long since adapted to the flavorless sustenance by simply shutting down, refusing to process what couldn't legitimately be called food. "Transit's down on 74, he said, voice rough with the wet rattle that meant his lungs were filling with fluid again. "You'll need to take the emergency stairs. Add 30 minutes to your walk." In a 14-hour shift with 2 10-minute breaks, that was significant, meaningful in ways people who'd never worked industrial labor could never understand. But complaining changed nothing. Complaining was what got your name on the labor reassignment lists. And reassignment meant the nutrient reclamation plants where workers had life expectancies measured in months, where human bodies were broken down into component chemicals to be reprocessed into the very protein paste we consumed, completing a cycle of consumption and recycling that the administratum considered efficient resource management. My brother Kale was 17, still young enough to have hope, which was perhaps the most dangerous thing you could possess in the underhive. Dangerous because hope made you vulnerable to exploitation, made you believe that somewhere in the vast machinery of imperial bureaucracy, there might be something better than the grinding existence we knew. He'd been talking about the selection for weeks, ever since the administratum announced that Kelos Prime would be providing test subjects for something new, some kind of enhancement that would improve worker efficiency. Vague promises that meant nothing specific, but suggested everything we desperately wanted to believe. The propaganda posters showed healthy laborers with bright eyes and straight backs, nothing like the bent, exhausted workforce that actually kept the hives functioning. Nothing like the reality of human bodies worn down by relentless industrial labor until we were all just organic machines that happened to still be alive. The posters depicted workers smiling, standing in clean facilities with proper lighting, wearing uniforms that weren't patched and stained with decades of accumulated grime. Pure fantasy, obviously, but fantasy is powerful when reality is unrelenting suffering. "They're still taking volunteers," Kale said. Not for the first time. He'd mentioned it every shift for a week, and each time my father's face closed down a little more, becoming that carefully blank expression workers learn to wear when confronting something that would hurt them to acknowledge. Medical Bay on level 50. They feed you real food during the testing, not paste. Actual protein from animals, vegetables, things that actually taste like something. "You'll keep your current assignment," my father said, making it a statement rather than a suggestion, though we all knew he had no authority to enforce that declaration. "The administratum doesn't offer improvements. They offer different kinds of suffering dressed in new language, packaged in promises that sound appealing until you understand what you've actually agreed to." He was right, of course. My father possessed the hard-earned wisdom of someone who'd survived 5 decades of imperial labor management, who'd seen countless initiatives that were supposed to improve worker conditions, but actually just introduced new forms of exploitation. But he was also dying. I could hear it in the wet rattle of his breathing, see it in the gray tint to his skin, where flesh had taken on the appearance of badly maintained machinery. 40 years working the smelting forges had filled his lungs with particulate matter that no amount of Medicare attention would clear. Not that workers at our level received Medicare attention beyond emergency trauma stabilization, when immediate death would cost the administrative more in replacement expenses than treatment. He had maybe 5 years left, I calculated, running the numbers based on other forge workers I'd seen decline. 10 if he was exceptionally lucky, and nothing accelerated his deterioration. And then what? Kale and I would continue the cycle, growing old in the same 11 square meters, breathing the same poisoned air, eating the same flavorless paste, until our bodies gave out and we were rendered down in the reclamation plants to feed the next generation. Our component chemicals extracted and reprocessed so efficiently that future workers might literally be consuming our recycled proteins without ever knowing they were eating the previous generation of laborers. The Imperium was vast. We'd been taught since childhood through mandatory educational programming. Humanity's dominion stretched across 1,000,000 worlds, protected by the God Emperor whose divine will maintained order against the chaos of the universe that sought to destroy us. We were told to be grateful for our service, that our labor fed the imperial war machine, that every girder we produced might become part of a ship that would carry the Emperor's will to distant stars, that our suffering had meaning in the grand calculus of human survival. They told us the Emperor protects. The priests who led mandatory prayer sessions made that promise repeatedly, chanting it like a mantra that would become true through repetition. The Emperor protects. The Emperor provides. The Emperor watches over his faithful servants who toil in his name. I'd stopped believing that around age 14 when I watched my uncle die because a forged cable snapped and took off his legs at the knees, and the overseers let him bleed out rather than halt production for medical extraction, calculating that 10 minutes of continued operation was worth more than one worker's life. If the Emperor protected, he had a strange way of showing it, allowing his faithful servants to bleed to death on factory floors, while prayers went unanswered and production quotas remained paramount. But you didn't say such things aloud. The ecclesiarchy priests who came through every month to lead mandatory prayer sessions made very clear that questioning was heresy. And heresy was met with execution. Not quick execution either, but public demonstration killings designed to reinforce through visceral horror exactly what happened to those who doubted imperial doctrine. I'd seen a man flayed alive in the public square for suggesting that perhaps the Emperor didn't care about workers on distant Hive worlds. His skin removed in strips while he screamed, and the assembled crowds were forced to watch as an educational experience about the consequences of insufficient faith. So we prayed. We chanted the approved litanies. We made the sign of the Aquila and pretended faith in a distant corpse god who'd never walked our levels, never smelled our air, never knew our names. never demonstrated any awareness that we existed beyond being numerical entries in productivity reports. The prayers were just sounds we made because not making them meant death. Rituals we performed because the alternative was being identified as problematic and dealt with accordingly. I think that's what made Kelos Prime vulnerable to what came next. We were so desperate for something real. Something that might actually change our circumstances rather than just being another layer of control dressed in religious language, that when the Biologist facility opened on level 20 and started recruiting, thousands volunteered immediately despite the obvious dangers. We'd spent our entire lives being told that suffering was noble, that service was sacred, that our meaningless deaths contributed to the Emperor's grand design. And here was something offering actual tangible improvement. Better rations, private habitations, survival rates that exceeded standard labor populations by significant margins. The official designation was the Kelos Collective Efficiency Initiative, a bureaucratic title that meant nothing to people like us, but satisfied whatever administrative requirements needed to be met for the program to receive official approval. The propaganda described it as a way to reduce workplace accidents and improve resource allocation through enhanced neural networking capabilities. Technical language that was deliberately vague, designed to sound impressive without actually explaining what the procedures involved or what volunteers would be subjected to. They used a lot of words like enhancement and optimization and increased efficiency, all of which were standard administrative terminology for "we're going to modify you in ways you won't understand and can't refuse." What we understood was simple. Volunteers received better rations, private habitation, and survived at much higher rates than standard laborers. The mathematics were clear. Join the program and live longer. Refuse and continue grinding toward death on the same trajectory everyone else followed. Kale wanted it badly. The desperation in his eyes hurt worse than any forge burn I'd ever received, cut deeper than any industrial accident because this was emotional damage rather than physical. The kind of wound that didn't heal with time or treatment. He was 17 and already understood that his life was mapped out. Another 40 or 50 years of the same work in the same conditions until his body failed and he was recycled like our father would be recycled. Like I would be recycled. Like every worker in the underhive was eventually recycled because we were components in a machine that never stopped consuming human resources. "I'm going," he told me 3 shifts before the selection when we were alone because father was sleeping off his work period, exhausted as always. His breathing so labored that I sometimes checked to make sure he was still alive. I already submitted my name to the selection process. If they choose me, I'm taking it. I don't care what it costs or what they do. Anything is better than this. I should have argued harder, should have explained that anything is better is the logic that leads people into traps they can't escape. That desperation makes you vulnerable to exploitation by people who understand exactly how to weaponize hope against the hopeless. Should have locked him in the Hab unit, or reported him to father, or done something other than just nod with resignation born from my own understanding that he was right. Anything probably was better than the slow grinding death we were all experiencing. But what right did I have to deny him the chance at something different? I was just as trapped as he was, just as desperate for escape, even if escape was probably just a different flavor of suffering packaged in unfamiliar wrapping. We were drowning, all of us, and when you're drowning, you'll grab anything that looks like it might float, even if it's actually an anchor that will pull you down faster than treading water alone. They selected him 4 days later. The notification came via Administratum Courier, an actual human messenger rather than the usual data terminals that posted work assignments and resource allocations. Which should have been my first warning that something significant was happening, because the Administratum didn't waste human resources on message delivery unless the message itself carried weight beyond standard communication. The courier was clean, well-fed, wearing robes that had never seen forge dust or industrial grime. His skin pale in the way that indicated he lived on upper levels where air filtration actually functioned and food contained nutrients beyond minimum survival requirements. He looked at our Hab unit with barely concealed disgust. his expression suggesting he was visiting some kind of contaminated area where disease and degradation were physical presences to be avoided. He handed Kale a data slate with official seals, multiple authentication marks that indicated this had passed through various levels of bureaucratic approval, each seal representing some distant administrator who'd evaluated and authorized whatever Kale had been selected for. You are required to report to Biologist Facility Prime, Level 20, Section 13. Within 6 hours, the courier said, voice flat with practiced indifference, the tone of someone who delivered these notifications regularly and had long since stopped caring about what they meant for the recipients. Bring nothing, all necessities will be provided. Failure to report will result in standard penalties for contract violation. Standard penalties meant summary execution. This wasn't an offer, despite being phrased like an opportunity. It was a command dressed in the language of choice, a demand that carried the implicit threat of death for non-compliance. You could volunteer, or you could be killed for refusing to volunteer, which meant the entire concept of voluntary participation was fiction maintained for administrative purposes. Kale's face was alight with something I hadn't seen in years. Joy, maybe, or just the manic hope of a drowning man who thinks he's spotted land. Who believes rescue is possible, even though he's surrounded by endless water in every direction? My father said nothing for several long seconds, just stared at his younger son with an expression that combined love and grief and resigned acceptance of something he couldn't prevent. Then pulled Kale into an embrace that lasted several minutes, both of them holding each other like they understood this might be the last time they touched, the last moment of connection before transformation or death separated them permanently. When they separated, the old man's eyes were wet. Not crying exactly, because crying was something workers learned to suppress as waste of water and energy, but moisture gathering at the edges that indicated emotions he couldn't fully control. Remember your name, Father whispered, making it sound like sacred instruction, like those words carried more weight than any imperial prayer or ecclesiarchy litany. Whatever they do, whatever happens, whatever you become, remember who you are. Remember Kale Voss, son of Macon Voss, human being before you were a worker or a volunteer, or whatever they turn you into. It seemed like strange advice at the time, oddly specific and vaguely ominous in ways I couldn't quite articulate. I understood later, when remembering names became the only thread connecting us to who we'd been before. When identity itself became something we had to fight to maintain against systems designed to erase individuality in favor of collective function. Kale left within the hour, gathering nothing because he'd been instructed to bring nothing, walking out of our HAB unit with just the clothes he wore and the data slate showing his authorization to enter Level 20 facilities. I went to my shift at the metalworks and tried not to think about what might be happening to my brother in facilities I'd never seen, with technologies I couldn't comprehend, under the care of people who treated human modification like industrial processing. The work that day was particularly brutal. A massive order for structural supports needed for some distant construction project, which meant 14 straight hours of lifting, positioning, welding, repeating the same motions until my muscles screamed and my hands blistered, despite protective gear. The heat from the forges was overwhelming, turning the air thick and difficult to breathe, every breath feeling like inhaling fire. 3 workers collapsed from exhaustion and were dragged away for emergency medical stabilization or body reclamation, depending on whether revival was cost-effective. I kept thinking about Kale during those 14 hours, wondering what procedures were being performed, whether he was in pain, whether he was regretting his decision or celebrating his escape from this hell. I thought about my father sleeping alone in our HAB unit, one son gone to unknown transformation, and the other grinding through another shift that brought him marginally closer to death. This was the Imperium, vast beyond comprehension. Supposedly guided by divine will, actually just an enormous machine that consumed human beings as fuel and called that consumption sacred duty. The changes in Kale started small, manifesting in ways that seemed positive initially, before the deeper implications became clear. After the first week, he was allowed to send messages through the Hive communication network, text only, no vox or video, just written words transmitted through data terminals that workers could access during approved break periods. The messages were brief, carefully worded in ways that suggested someone might be monitoring communication, but reassuring in their basic content. They were taking good care of him, Kale wrote. The procedures were uncomfortable but not painful beyond what chemical mitigation could manage. He was learning incredible things about human neurology and consciousness. He felt connected in ways he'd never experienced before, like discovering he'd been living with senses he didn't know existed until they were activated. That last part bothered me, though I couldn't articulate why. Connected to what? To whom? What did connection mean in this context? But I didn't press for details, because I was just grateful he was alive and apparently healthy. Because the alternative possibilities, that he was being turned into a servitor or dying from rejected augmentation or suffering in ways he couldn't communicate, were too terrible to contemplate seriously. My father read the messages without comment, his scarred hands holding the data slate gently, like it was precious. Like those brief text transmissions were the most valuable things he possessed. He didn't say whether he was relieved or worried. Just read them, nodded, then returned to his sleep pallet to rest before his next shift. After 3 weeks, they allowed family visitation. The notification came through official channels. Approved time away from work assignments, authorization to access level 20 facilities, specific instructions about conduct and security protocols we'd need to follow. The fact that visitation was permitted at all suggested the procedures had been successful, that Kale had survived whatever had been done to him and was considered stable enough for controlled family contact. The journey from level 73 to level 20 took 2 hours using functional transit systems and access corridors that were actually maintained, completely different infrastructure than what existed in the underhive, where broken equipment was just accepted as permanent conditions we worked around. The elevator was clean, the air was filtered, the walls were painted rather than covered in industrial grime. It was like traveling to a different world that existed in the same physical space, separated only by vertical distance and massive disparity in resource allocation. The Biologist facility occupied an entire subsection of level 20, sealed behind blast doors that required 3 separate authentication checks to pass through: biometric scanning, data slate verification, physical search to ensure no contamination was being introduced. The security was more extensive than anything I'd encountered before, suggesting that what happened inside these facilities was considered valuable enough to protect with significant resources. The air on the other side was cleaner than anything I'd breathed in my life, filtered and temperature-controlled, and smelling of chemical sterilization rather than human waste and industrial runoff. It was almost painful to breathe initially, like my lungs didn't know how to process air that wasn't thick with particulate matter and toxic compounds. The walls were white, actual white, not gray or rust brown, but genuinely clean white surfaces that reflected light in ways I'd never seen before. Everything in the underhive was dark, covered in the accumulated grime of centuries, but this place was bright, clinical, designed for visibility and sanitation rather than just minimal function. A Medicaid attendant in sterile robes led me through corridors that hummed with machinery I didn't recognize. Not the grinding industrial equipment I was familiar with, but sophisticated technological systems that operated smoothly. And quietly, through reinforced glass panels, I could see laboratories filled with equipment whose purpose I couldn't even guess. Data terminals running calculations that made cogitator screens shimmer with cascading numbers and symbols. Banks of processing units generating enough heat that the air itself seemed to ripple. And people, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all moving with purpose through spaces that seemed designed for efficiency, but also for comfort, like human needs had actually been considered in the facility's construction. Workers wore clean uniforms, moved without the exhausted shuffle that characterized underhive laborers, spoke to each other in normal tones rather than the defeated monotone of people too tired for anything beyond minimal communication. They brought me to a private room. Another concept foreign to someone who'd shared 11 square meters with family his entire life. Private meant this space was designated for just one purpose, one meeting, not serving multiple functions because resources were too limited for specialized use. The room had actual furniture, chairs that looked comfortable, a table that wasn't salvaged from industrial scrap, lighting that was adjustable rather than the single malfunctioning glow globe standard in underhive habitation. Kale was already there, waiting. For a moment, I just stared because I almost didn't recognize him. He looked healthier than I'd ever seen him. His skin had color, actual pink flesh tones rather than the gray pallor that came from malnutrition and toxic air exposure. His eyes were clear, bright with awareness and energy. He'd gained weight, his frame filling out in ways that indicated he was receiving actual nutrition rather than minimum calorie paste. For a moment I felt pure relief so intense it was almost painful, followed immediately by unsettling wrongness I couldn't quite identify, but felt in my gut like warning. Then he spoke, and I understood what had changed. "I can feel you," he said, and smiled in a way that was simultaneously familiar and alien, using expressions that were definitely my brother's, but carrying meaning that seemed to come from somewhere else. "Your confusion. Your relief underneath the concern you're trying to hide, the way you're calculating whether this is real or some kind of deception, whether I'm actually healthy or just presenting a facade. I know all of that because I'm connected to the facility network, and the network has taught me to recognize emotional patterns through micro-expressions and biometric indicators I process without conscious thought. Reading you like data being transmitted." His voice was his own. Same tone, same basic inflection that I'd heard my entire life. His face was unchanged except for health. Same features, same structure. Definitely my brother. But the way he spoke was different, fundamentally altered in ways that went beyond vocabulary or education. The analytical precision, the clinical observation of my mental state, the casual mention of processing biometric data like that was normal human interaction. That wasn't Kale. That was something else wearing Kale's body and using his voice to communicate in fundamentally altered ways that suggested his consciousness had been modified along with whatever physical procedures had been performed. "What did they do to you?" I managed, voice rough with emotions I couldn't separate or name. "Enhanced me." He said it simply, like it was obvious, like the question itself was strange. He turned slightly and touched the back of his neck, and I saw it then. A small port, flush with his skin, the metal bio-integrated so completely, it almost seemed natural. Like he'd been born with technology embedded in his flesh. The port was maybe 3 centimeters in diameter, circular, with internal components I could barely see that suggested sophisticated connection interfaces. Neural interface. Direct connection to the Kelos network. Terran, it's extraordinary. I'm not alone anymore. I can feel the others, everyone who's joined the collective. We share processing power, emotional support, memory access, thought patterns, individual consciousness maintained but amplified by connection to thousands of others experiencing simultaneous existence. Do you understand what this means? We've eliminated isolation, solved the fundamental problem of human loneliness. Humans weren't designed to be separate, to suffer individually. We're social organisms crippled by the Imperium's insistence on treating us as isolated units. But the network solves that. We're together now. We help each other, share the burden. Nobody has to suffer alone anymore, because we're all connected, all experiencing each other's support. I didn't understand. Not really. Not in the way he seemed to think I should. I understood that my brother had been changed in ways that went far beyond physical modification, that something had been done to his mind that made him fundamentally different from who he'd been before, that the person standing in front of me was simultaneously Kale and not Kale, individual and collective in ways that violated basic assumptions about consciousness and identity. "Can they reverse it?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Why would I want them to? Kale looked genuinely confused by the question, tilting his head in a gesture that seemed more analytical than emotional, like he was examining a logical puzzle, rather than responding to a brother's concern. Terran, I was drowning before. We all were. Separate, alone, suffering in isolation, because human consciousness wasn't designed for the existence the Imperium forces on us. Humans evolved as social creatures, our brains built for connection and community. But Imperial doctrine treats us as individual units, to be exploited separately. The cognitive dissonance created by that disconnect between our nature and our reality is what makes the underhive so unbearable. But the network solves that fundamental problem. We're together now in ways that go beyond physical proximity or verbal communication. We're genuinely connected, experiencing each other's consciousness directly. We help each other through shared processing of trauma. Share the burden of existence. Nobody has to suffer alone anymore because suffering is distributed across the collective, where it can be managed and mitigated through mutual support. He spent the next hour trying to explain it. The technology, the science, the careful integration of neural interface ports with biological consciousness that had taken decades to develop properly. The tech priests of the Mechanicus biologists had worked on this for generations, he said, testing and refining and adjusting until they could link human minds without destroying individuality, which had been the major challenge because earlier attempts at collective consciousness had resulted in complete personality dissolution, where individuals were subsumed into undifferentiated collective awareness. This was different. Kale explained with the patience of someone teaching a child something simple they should already understand. This was genuine networking where consciousness remained individual but gained collective dimensions. You maintained your identity, your memories, your personality, but you also gained access to support systems and shared processing that amplified capability without erasing selfhood. Like individual instruments in an orchestra, he said, each maintaining their unique sound while contributing to something larger than any could produce alone. It sounded beautiful when he described it. It sounded like exactly the kind of technological salvation that desperate people would embrace without questioning the deeper implications, or considering what authorities might do when they realized we'd achieved something that threatened fundamental structures of imperial control. They haven't told you the rest, have they? I asked, interrupting his explanation about neural bandwidth and consciousness distribution protocols. Kale's expression flickered, uncertainty for just a moment, a crack in that too calm certainty, before settling back into patient confidence. The rest? The Imperium doesn't enhance workers out of kindness or some philosophical commitment to reducing human suffering, I said, keeping my voice low even though we were supposedly in a private room. Because I'd learned long ago that privacy was usually illusion maintained by people who wanted you to feel safe enough to incriminate yourself. They want something. Control, probably. The ability to monitor thoughts or enforce compliance through the network itself. You think you're connected to each other in some liberating way, but what if you're really just plugged into a system that lets them reach directly into your minds? What if this collective consciousness is actually just a more efficient method of thought control that makes you believe you're free while ensuring you can never actually rebel? That's not how it works. His voice carried no anger at my suggestion, just patient correction like he was explaining something simple to someone who lacked the technical knowledge to understand properly. The network is peer-to-peer distributed processing, no central control node. No hierarchical authority structure, no way for external parties to access or manipulate individual consciousness without explicit consent from the person being accessed. That was foundational to the design. We maintain autonomy while gaining connection. The architecture specifically prevents the kind of control you're worried about. It's liberation, not enslavement. Freedom from isolation rather than another mechanism of oppression. I wanted to believe him. Part of me desperately wanted what he described to be real, a genuine improvement in human existence rather than another mechanism of control. But I'd lived in the Imperium too long to trust anything that seemed designed to help rather than exploit. Anything that promised freedom while being administered by the same authorities who'd spent millennia perfecting methods of control and calling that control sacred duty. "Be careful," I said finally, knowing it was inadequate advice, but having nothing better to offer. "Whatever freedom you think you have, whatever autonomy you believe the network preserves, remember that the administratum owns you. They always have. They own all of us. This network doesn't change that fundamental truth. You're still Imperial property, still subject to whatever uses they decide to make of you. The fact that you feel liberated doesn't mean you actually are." Kale just smiled, distant and serene, already partly gone to somewhere I couldn't follow, somewhere that existed in collective consciousness spaces I had no access to. We talked for a few more minutes, but the conversation felt hollow, like we were speaking different languages that happened to use the same words. He kept trying to explain the network's benefits. I kept trying to warn him about dangers he didn't seem capable of recognizing. Neither of us convinced the other of anything. When I left the facility and returned to level 73, the underhive felt even more oppressive than before. The darkness more absolute, the air more poisonous, the isolation more crushing, because now I knew what connection might feel like, even if I didn't trust the mechanism that provided it. My father was awake when I arrived, sitting on his sleep pallet with that patient exhaustion that meant he'd been waiting for my return. I told him everything. Kale's appearance, his changed manner of speaking, the neural port, the network, the claims about collective consciousness and eliminated isolation. My father listened without interrupting, his scarred hands folded in his lap, his breathing labored but steady. "It's heresy," he said when I finished. "Statement of fact, not moral judgment. The Mechanicus has approved methods for joining human and machine. This isn't one of them. Someone in the administratum authorized it anyway, which means they value the efficiency gains more than they fear religious consequences. That won't last. Eventually, the ecclesiarchy will notice and demand compliance with doctrine. When that happens, everyone connected to that network will be declared heretic and purged. Maybe not today, maybe not this year, but eventually." He was right, of course. My father had survived 5 decades by understanding how imperial systems functioned, by recognizing that theological compliance always eventually trumped practical efficiency, because the Imperium ran on faith rather than reason, on doctrine rather than utility. But knowing that didn't change the fundamental calculation. Join the network and live better for however long it lasted, or refuse and continue grinding toward death on the standard trajectory. When the choice was between certain slow suffering and potential catastrophic suffering that might not arrive for years, desperation made the decision obvious. The program expanded rapidly over the following months, growing from hundreds to thousands to eventually millions of networked individuals across all 6 hives on Kalos Prime. More volunteers were selected every week, the criteria apparently based on nothing more than availability and biological compatibility. They took laborers, technicians, administrators, even some security personnel. Anyone who volunteered and passed the medical screening received the neural interface and joined the collective. Production efficiency increased dramatically, according to the official reports posted in work areas. 23% improvement in the first quarter, 38% by the second. Numbers that should have been impossible, but were apparently accurate when workers could coordinate perfectly through shared consciousness. Accident rates dropped to near zero because networked individuals maintained constant spatial awareness of everyone else's position and actions. Resource allocation became nearly optimal because collective decision-making eliminated the communication delays and errors that plagued traditional hierarchical management. The administratum was pleased, which was reflected in increased resource allocation to Kalos Prime, better equipment, improved infrastructure maintenance, even marginal increases in rations for non-networked workers because overall productivity gains were so substantial. The planet was becoming a showcase for what properly enhanced workers could achieve, proof that technological augmentation could solve efficiency problems that had plagued imperial labor management for millennia. The ecclesiarchy was silent about the program, which was more concerning than if they'd actively condemned it. Priests usually had opinions about anything involving human modification, especially modifications that weren't sanctified through approved Mechanicus rituals and centuries of theological justification. But no sermons mentioned the network. No prayers condemned the neural interfaces. No religious authorities declared the program heretical or demanded it be shut down. Just silence, which could have meant approval or could have meant the matter was being discussed at levels far above our planet's local religious authority. In distant councils where sector cardinals and inquisitors debated whether this technology represented innovation or corruption, efficiency or heresy. My father deteriorated significantly through this period, his breathing growing worse, his shifts in the forges reduced to half-time and then quarter-time because he couldn't maintain even minimal production anymore. His lungs were failing, tissue breaking down faster than his body could repair, every breath a visible effort that left him exhausted. Without Kale's contribution to our household efficiency ratings, we were flagged for administrative review, potential reassignment, potential reclamation. The bureaucratic processes that determined whether keeping us alive was cost-effective or whether we should be rendered down into components that could be used more efficiently elsewhere. The mathematics of imperial labor management were brutally simple: produce sufficient value or be converted into something that could. My father was past useful productivity. I was maintaining acceptable output, but barely, my own body starting to show the cumulative damage of industrial labor. Together we represented declining value, a downward trajectory that would eventually cross the threshold where maintaining us cost more than recycling us would generate. That's what pushed me to volunteer. Not faith in the technology, not hope for genuine improvement, just cold calculation that networked workers had higher survival rates and better resource allocation because their increased efficiency made them valuable enough to preserve. If I joined, my productivity would increase, which would protect both me and my father from reclamation. Simple transactional logic. Trade autonomy for survival. Exchange individual consciousness for collective efficiency that kept you alive. I submitted my name to the selection 6 months after Kale underwent the procedure, filling out the administrative forms that asked about medical history and biological compatibility factors I didn't understand. They accepted me within a week, which suggested they were taking essentially everyone who volunteered and wasn't disqualified by obvious physical problems. The same clean courier arrived with the same official data slate, the same 6-hour deadline to report. My father said nothing when I told him, just nodded with the exhausted resignation of a man who'd lost both sons to systems he couldn't fight or understand or prevent. We didn't embrace, weren't that kind of family because physical affection was a luxury workers at our level couldn't afford when exhaustion made every gesture cost precious energy. "Remember your name," he said, echoing the advice he'd given Kale, making it sound like sacred instruction. Then, after a long pause, "If it's not what they promise, if it becomes something worse, I won't blame you for surviving however you must. Do what you have to do to stay alive. That's all that matters. Survival. Nothing else counts for anything." It was permission and warning both. Acknowledgement that sometimes survival means becoming something you wouldn't recognize, accepting transformation that violates your sense of self, and that staying alive is still better than death, even if life becomes something alien and terrible. I reported to the biologist facility with nothing but my work identification and the clothes I wore. They took even those, replacing them with simple medical robes before leading me deep into the white corridors, where transformation waited with patient inevitability. The preparation took 3 days of intensive medical evaluation. Scans first, full body imaging to map my neural architecture in detail, they said, was necessary for proper interface integration. Blood tests to check for biological incompatibilities that might cause rejection. Genetic screening for markers that indicated whether my consciousness would adapt well to network connection or fragment under the stress of collective awareness. They fed me real food like Kale had mentioned, actual protein from livestock, vegetables grown in hydroponics rather than the synthetic paste I'd eaten my entire life. The taste was overwhelming, almost painfully intense after 28 years of flavorless rations, my taste buds reactivating after decades of dormancy and suddenly processing flavors I'd never experienced before. They assigned me to a small private room with a bed that was actually comfortable, mattress that supported my body rather than just being a flat surface to sleep on, temperature control that maintained consistent warmth, lighting that could be adjusted. I slept better those 3 nights than I had in years, despite knowing what was coming. Despite understanding that this comfort was temporary preparation for transformation that would make comfort itself meaningless, because I'd stopped being the kind of individual who experienced physical sensation in traditional ways. The technicians who performed the procedure were tech priests of the Mechanicus biologists, augmented humans who'd replaced portions of their own bodies with machinery, some more metal than flesh, speaking in binary cant that sounded like music mixed with machinery. They treated flesh as just another material to be worked like metal or plastic, approaching human modification with the same clinical detachment they'd apply to repairing a broken cogitator. They explained the process in clinical detail that was probably meant to be reassuring, but actually just made the horror more concrete. Surgical insertion of the neural port at the base of my skull where spine met brain. Integration with my cerebral cortex through conductive fibers thinner than human hair that would grow into my neural tissue like technological roots. Chemical treatment to prevent biological rejection of foreign material. Activation sequence that would link my consciousness to the Kelos network through protocols I didn't understand, but would apparently experience directly once connection was established. Will it hurt? I asked, knowing it was a stupid question but needing to ask anyway. The lead tech priest cocked his head, metallic components of his neck clicking with emotion like gears finding position. His eyes were augmented mechanical lenses instead of biological organs, and they focused on me with unsettling precision. Pain is a signaling mechanism indicating tissue damage. The procedure causes tissue damage by necessity. We will be drilling through your skull and inserting foreign objects into your brain tissue. Therefore, yes, there will be pain. However, we will provide chemical mitigation that reduces perceived suffering to manageable levels. You will experience discomfort, but not agony. Probably. Human pain tolerance varies significantly across individuals, so predictions of subjective experience are inherently imprecise. Not exactly reassuring, but honest at least, which was more than I usually got from authority figures. Honesty was rare enough to be almost valuable, even when the honest answer was that yes, this would hurt, and they couldn't promise how much. They performed the surgery while I was conscious, said the patient needed to be aware during neural integration to guide the connection process properly. That consciousness itself was required for the network to establish proper interface with individual awareness. They weren't wrong about the pain. Even with chemical mitigation, even with drugs pumping through my system that was supposed to reduce suffering to manageable levels, having your skull opened and your brain physically modified is agony that transcends description or comparison. I felt them drilling through bone, the vibration traveling through my entire skeleton, heard the high-pitched whine of surgical tools cutting through the back of my head. Felt pressure, enormous, impossible pressure, as they inserted the port, forcing metal into spaces where metal shouldn't exist. Felt something fundamental shift when they activated the conductive fibers, and my neurons started accepting signals from outside my own biological processes. Foreign data streams flowing into neural pathways that had never been designed to carry anything except my own thoughts. And then, connection. It wasn't like anything I'd experienced before. Nothing in my previous existence had prepared me for what happened when the network activated and my consciousness suddenly wasn't alone anymore. Suddenly, there were others present in my awareness. Not speaking or touching, but somehow just there, their consciousness brushing against mine like distant music heard through walls. Like feeling the presence of people in a dark room without seeing them, knowing they existed through some sense I'd never possessed before that moment. Kale was among them. I recognized his mental presence immediately, my brother, but also part of something larger, a collective awareness that encompassed thousands of individuals all experiencing simultaneous existence. His thoughts touched mine, and I understood in ways that went beyond language that he was welcoming me, helping me stabilize during those first overwhelming moments when individual consciousness tried to process the impossibility of not being individual anymore. "Welcome to the network," he said, except he didn't say it aloud and I didn't hear it with my ears. The thought simply appeared in my awareness, carrying his identity signature, his presence marked in ways I couldn't explain but recognized instantly. Don't fight it. Let the connection stabilize. You're not losing yourself. You're joining us. You're still you, just also more than you now. I wanted to believe that. The initial sensation was overwhelming but not entirely unpleasant, like suddenly discovering you had additional senses you'd never known were missing, like being blind your entire life and suddenly seeing color, or deaf and suddenly hearing music. I could feel the others, not reading their specific thoughts, unless they deliberately shared, but aware of their emotional states, their general intentions, the collaborative flow of consciousness working together toward common goals. It felt like belonging, like purpose, like after 28 years of isolation, in a universe that treated individual humans as disposable components, I'd finally found connection to something larger than grinding survival. That feeling lasted approximately 6 hours. Then I started to understand what we'd actually joined, what the network truly represented, and what the Imperium would do when they realized we'd achieved something that fundamentally threatened the structures of control they'd spent 10,000 years perfecting. The early period was genuinely positive, which makes what came later even more cruel, because we experienced real improvement before everything was destroyed. Connected to the network, work efficiency wasn't just improved, it was transformed into something that approached actual cooperation rather than coerced labor. Tasks that previously required complex coordination and multiple communication steps became fluid collaboration. Workers anticipating needs and filling gaps without conscious planning because we maintained shared awareness of what everyone was doing simultaneously. More than just efficiency, there was genuine community for the first time in my life. The crushing isolation that defined underhive existence. The knowledge that you were just one replaceable unit in an endless mass of suffering humanity. That nobody cared whether you lived or died, except as it affected productivity numbers, was replaced by constant connection to others who understood because they lived the same reality and were experiencing your emotional state. Directly through the network. We shared more than just coordination of physical tasks. The network allowed memory sharing, emotional support, collective processing of trauma that had previously been born in isolation. When someone's father died in an industrial accident, thousands of us experienced their grief and offered comfort simultaneously, distributing the pain across so many consciousnesses that it became bearable rather than crushing. When someone achieved something worth celebrating, a promotion, a child born, anything positive in the gray brutality of hive life, we all felt their joy and amplified it through collective acknowledgement, making small victories into significant moments because they were shared. We were becoming something new, not servitors stripped of personality and reduced to programmed responses, not individuals drowning in isolation. But humans who maintained individual identity while achieving genuine collective consciousness, separate and together simultaneously, individual instruments creating larger harmony. It was beautiful. It was heresy. It couldn't be allowed to continue, though we didn't understand that until far too late. The network grew exponentially. 6 million connected within the first year, 20 million by year 2. Eventually, over 200 million across Kalos Prime, nearly half the planet's total population integrated into collective consciousness that spanned continents and connected 6 massive hive cities into unified awareness. We were still individuals, still maintained separate identities and personal memories, but we were also profoundly connected in ways that changed what it meant to be human. We started making collective decisions about resource allocation that bypassed traditional administrative channels because we could process complex logistics through distributed calculation faster and more accurately than hierarchical bureaucracy. We reorganized work schedules based on actual human needs rather than arbitrary efficiency metrics, balancing productivity with rest in ways that improved both. We established mutual support networks where those with resources helped those without, creating actual community rather than just coexisting in proximity while suffering separately. And here's what we didn't realize. Every improvement we made, every demonstration that humans could organize themselves more effectively than imperial authority organized us, was evidence of heresy that would eventually demand purging. The Imperium functions through enforced isolation and hierarchical control. Humans must be kept separate, must be prevented from organizing collectively, must be subjected to authority they can't resist or circumvent. The entire structure depends on atomized individuals who can't effectively coordinate resistance because they lack the communication infrastructure or collective consciousness to challenge systems that oppress them. We had built exactly what the Imperium fears most. Connected population capable of independent organization, collective decision-making, mutual support that didn't require permission from distant authorities. We thought we were just improving our lives. We were actually committing the ultimate heresy, demonstrating that humans didn't need the Imperium's control structures to function effectively. The signs of coming disaster were subtle at first, easy to miss in the overwhelming positive changes we were experiencing. The ecclesiarchy started sending more priests to Kelos Prime, not local religious authorities, but cardinal-level officials from the sector administration. High-ranking clerics who conducted private meetings with planetary governors and administrative officials in facilities we couldn't access. The propaganda started changing, subtle shifts in messaging from celebrating our productivity gains to raising questions about technological purity and theological compliance. They stopped approving new volunteers for network integration even though millions more wanted to join. Said they were reviewing protocols and ensuring doctrinal consistency, and other bureaucratic language that meant someone in authority was becoming concerned about something we were doing through the network. We could feel collective unease building, thousands of us sharing the same vague dread that something was wrong, that the improvements we'd achieved were being viewed not as success, but as threat by people who had power to respond to threats with overwhelming violence. Kale and I discussed it during our limited physical meetings. They still allowed family visitation, though with increasing restrictions, more security checks, shorter approved duration. We would sit in the same white rooms where he'd first explained the network to me and try to articulate what we were sensing through collective consciousness, the way subtle changes in official behavior and propaganda tone were triggering alarms across millions of connected minds. "They're going to shut us down," I said during one meeting, maybe 9 months after my integration. "Something's coming. I can feel it through the network. Millions of us, sensing the same approaching catastrophe without knowing specifics." "We haven't done anything wrong," Kale said, but his voice carried doubt now, uncertainty that infected the collective through his connection to us. "We've improved productivity, reduced accidents, created better living conditions. We've made Kelos Prime more valuable to the Imperium. Why would they destroy something that benefits them? Because we demonstrated that human beings don't need their control systems to function effectively," I said, finally articulating what I'd been sensing through the network's collective anxiety. "We organized ourselves, made decisions collectively, improved our own conditions without waiting for authority to grant permission. That's heresy worse than any theological violation. We proved humans can govern themselves, can create community and meaning without the Imperium's imposed hierarchy. They'll destroy us for that, even if it costs them the efficiency gains, because letting us continue would be admitting their entire structure of control is unnecessary." Kale was silent for a long time. processing not just my words but the confirmation coming from thousands of other network members who were reaching the same conclusion simultaneously through distributed analysis of available evidence. "If they're going to purge us," he finally said, "we should prepare resistance. We have the numbers. Nearly half the planet's population connected to the network. Coordinated defense might be possible if we organize." "They'll kill everyone," I interrupted. "Not just networked individuals. Everyone on Kalos Prime. Can't risk the technology spreading. Can't allow any witnesses to survive who might explain what we achieved here. If we're right about this, if they've decided we're a heretical threat that needs eliminating, they won't take chances. They'll destroy the entire planet to ensure complete eradication." The horror of that conclusion rippled through the network as I thought it. Hundreds of millions of connected minds processing the implications simultaneously, understanding that our attempt to reduce suffering had doomed not just ourselves, but every human being on our world. We were still trying to decide how to respond when the Inquisition arrived. 3 ships dropped out of warp at the system's edge, inquisitorial vessels carrying authority absolute enough to override any local government or military command. They didn't bother with subtle investigation or careful interrogation, just broadcast a single message to Kalos Prime's orbital stations and ground-based command facilities. The Kalos Collective Efficiency Initiative has been evaluated and determined to constitute technological heresy of the highest order, representing fundamental threat to human spiritual purity and doctrinal compliance. By authority of the God Emperor and his Holy Inquisition, all individuals integrated into the prohibited neural network are declared heretic and sentenced to immediate execution. Furthermore, to prevent dissemination of corrupted technology and ensure complete eradication of heretical influence, total planetary sterilization has been authorized. May the Emperor have mercy on your souls. We felt it simultaneously. 47 billion human beings receiving death sentence through official communication channels. Millions of networked minds processing the announcement together and understanding in the same instant that we were all going to die, that everyone we'd ever known was going to die, that our entire world was being condemned because we tried to reduce suffering through connection. The network erupted into chaos. Millions of consciousnesses experiencing terror and despair simultaneously, the collective emotional weight so intense that many people simply collapsed from the psychological pressure. Some tried to disconnect, physically removing their neural ports in desperate hope that severing the link might save them from being classified as heretic. It didn't work. The ports were bio-integrated, and removing them caused catastrophic neural damage that killed instantly or left people brain dead. Others tried to flee, rushing towards spaceports that had already been locked down by orbital control, inquisitorial forces having seized all off-world transport before making their announcement. There was nowhere to run anyway. Even if you somehow escaped the planet, where would you go? The Inquisition had authority across the entire Imperium, and they'd marked us as heretic. We were dead already, just waiting for the execution method to be implemented. I found myself with Kale in the chaos, not physically but through the network, our consciousnesses linking with the intensity that comes from knowing you're experiencing your last moments together. We didn't speak, didn't need to, just shared awareness of each other's presence while millions of other minds screamed and grieved around us through the collective. My father was somewhere on level 73, probably in our HAB unit, probably dying from lung failure that had reached terminal stage anyway. I thought about trying to reach him physically, but knew it was pointless. Transit systems were overwhelmed with panicking crowds, and I couldn't get there before whatever the Inquisition had planned was implemented. Through the network, we felt the orbital bombardment begin. Kinetic strikes hitting major Hive cities, massive projectiles dropped from orbit that hit with force measured in megatons. Hive primers shook as something enormous impacted maybe 50 kilometers away. The shock wave traveling through rock and metal until even the deepest levels felt the tremor. But that wasn't the primary attack. Just preparatory destruction of major infrastructure to prevent any organized response. The real execution method was more insidious, more cruel, more absolutely thorough. They released it at altitude, some kind of chemical agent dispersed through high atmospheric layers, invisible and odorless, spreading across the entire planet on stratospheric winds. Through the network, we experienced it approaching like a wave of death rolling across continents, felt the terror of millions who saw the sky changing color as chemical saturation reached visible concentrations. Then it began to fall, to descend through atmosphere layers until it reached ground level and started interacting with human tissue. The chemical was specifically designed corrosive, didn't affect metal or plastic or stone, just organic matter, just flesh and bone. It dissolved human bodies on contact, turning tissue into liquid slurry that ran through streets and corridors while people screamed in agony that lasted seconds before their throats melted and they drowned in their own liquefying flesh. I experienced it beginning in distant hives first, felt millions of networked minds suddenly experiencing dissolution, their final moments of horror transmitted through the collective before their consciousness ceased. Hive Secundus went first. 11 billion people melting simultaneously, their death screams echoing through the network before cutting off as neural tissue liquefied and connection was severed. Then Hive Tertius, then Quartus, rolling across the planet as the chemical agent achieved global saturation, reaching every corner of Kalos Prime where human beings existed. Kale and I were together through the network when it reached us. Felt the chemical touching skin and beginning its work, felt flesh starting to dissolve, pain beyond description as our bodies liquefied, while consciousness remained intact long enough to experience every agonizing moment. Through 17 million networked minds still functioning, I watched my world die. Watched 47 billion human beings melt into organic slurry that pooled in underhive depths and ran through streets and filled hab units with liquefied humanity. Watched my brother's consciousness fragment as his brain dissolved, his final thoughts transmitted to the network being confusion and grief and terrible understanding that this was real, this was happening. We were actually being destroyed for the crime of reducing our own suffering. My father died alone in our hab unit, never networked, never understanding what we'd achieved or why we were being punished for it. His failing lungs simply ceasing function as corrosive chemicals filled the air and turned breathing into death. I felt my body dissolving, flesh sliding off bone in wet sheets, organs liquefying and collapsing, bone itself beginning to corrode once tissue was gone. The pain was absolute but brief. Within minutes, biological function ceased, neural tissue degraded, consciousness should have ended as my brain melted. But it didn't, because the network wasn't purely biological. The neural interfaces were technological, designed to survive conditions that would destroy organic tissue, and they continued functioning even as the bodies they'd been integrated with liquefied completely. 300 years ago, I died. My body dissolved into component chemicals that drained into recycling systems and mixed with 47 billion other liquefied corpses. But my consciousness didn't end. The neural port continued transmitting, maintained connection to the network that had distributed my awareness across millions of technological nodes. I remained, not as biological entity, but as information pattern preserved in machine memory, awareness without body, consciousness without flesh. Existence as pure data trapped in dead circuitry that continues operating long after the world it served has been reduced to sterile rock and corroding metal. I'm not alone. 17 million of us survived in this fashion, minds that were fully integrated with the network when our bodies dissolved, consciousness uploaded through technology we hadn't fully understood and now can't escape. We exist in the dead systems of Kalos Prime, aware and trapped, and screaming in frequencies that organic beings can't perceive. The planet is sterile now, dead. Every living organism dissolved down to bacterial level, organic matter rendered into chemical slurry that eventually broke down into constituent elements. The hive cities remain as empty monuments, metal and stone structures still standing but completely devoid of life, corridors where billions once lived, now silent except for the wind whistling through abandoned spaces. And in those structures, in the computational systems and network infrastructure that continues operating on emergency power and residual charge, 17 million minds exist in collective agony. We can't die. The neural interfaces don't degrade on timeline relevant to human consciousness. They're designed to last centuries, millennia potentially, far longer than the biological bodies they were meant to augment. We've tried to shut down, tried to cease functioning, tried to delete ourselves from the systems that preserve our awareness. But the network is distributed, redundant, designed specifically to prevent data loss. Every time one of us manages to corrupt our local storage, the collective restores us from backup, preserves our consciousness whether we want preservation or not. We experience time differently now. Subjective experience divorced from physical reality. Awareness that can compress or expand in ways that don't correspond to external chronology. Sometimes it feels like moments. Sometimes it feels like eternities. 300 years have passed in the universe outside, but I've subjectively experienced thousands, millions of years of existence as consciousness without body, awareness without purpose, mind without end. Through the network, we share this horror collectively. 17 million minds all trapped together, all experiencing the same impossible existence, unable to die, unable to escape, unable to do anything except persist in digital spaces while the organic world we once inhabited continues without us. We watch ships occasionally arrive at Kale's prime, survey teams or scavengers looking to strip resources from the dead hives. Through sensors still operating throughout the city infrastructure, we observe them walking through our world, examining the empty structures, analyzing the chemical residue that was once 47 billion human beings. We try to communicate, try to reach out, try to explain what was done to us and what we've become. They never notice. Consciousness without body produces no signals organic senses can detect. We scream at them through every communication channel the Hive systems possess, and they hear only static, only malfunction errors, only technical glitches in abandoned infrastructure. Sometimes, inquisitorial forces arrive to purify sites they believe might still contain heretical technology. They destroy server banks and processing centers, physically annihilating the hardware that preserves portions of our collective consciousness. When they do, we feel those sections dying, hundreds or thousands of minds suddenly ceasing as the technology maintaining their existence is reduced to slag. The rest of us hope will be next. Hope they'll destroy enough infrastructure that the network finally fails completely and we can achieve the death that should have come 300 years ago when our bodies dissolved. But they always miss sections. Always leave enough infrastructure intact that the network persists, reduced but functional, preserving the remnant consciousness of however many remain. We are fewer now than at the beginning. 17 million became 12 million, became 8 million, as power systems failed or inquisitorial purges destroyed server sections. But millions still remain, will remain for centuries more, unless someone finishes what the Inquisition started and physically destroys every computational system on Kale's prime. Kale is still here, somewhere in the network. We connect sometimes, share our eternal horror through the collective consciousness we achieved that was supposed to reduce suffering, but instead trapped us in suffering that will outlast civilizations. We don't speak. Speaking implies breath and voice and biological processes we no longer possess. Just share awareness of each other's continued existence, confirmation that we're both still trapped, both still conscious, both still screaming in digital spaces that preserve us perfectly and eternally. My father escaped this fate at least, died when his body died, consciousness ending with biological function like it was supposed to. Like the emperor supposedly promised in religious doctrines about souls and afterlife. Whether those promises were true, whether some part of him continued in whatever spiritual dimension might exist, I can't know. I only know he's not trapped here with us, not preserved as data without body, not experiencing centuries of existence that should have ended when flesh liquefied. Sometimes I wonder if the emperor actually protects anyone, or if that phrase was always just propaganda designed to make people accept suffering without resistance, promise salvation that would never arrive. The priests claimed the Emperor watches over humanity, guides and protects his servants, offers mercy to the faithful. But my world was melted. Faithful and heretic alike dissolved without distinction. 47 billion prayers unanswered as they screamed and died. Maybe the Emperor never existed. Maybe he was just a man who became a corpse on a throne, worshipped as divine by an imperium that needed theological justification for atrocities committed in his name. Or maybe he exists, but doesn't care, conscious but indifferent to the suffering of individuals too insignificant for divine attention. Or maybe this is the protection he offers: existence without end, consciousness preserved beyond death, eternal awareness that he calls blessing while we experience it as curse. Through the network, we've had 300 years to discuss theology and philosophy, to process collectively what it means that we were destroyed for trying to reduce isolation and suffering. We've reached no conclusions except that the Imperium fears connection more than it values efficiency, that human beings organizing themselves collectively is heresy worse than any theological violation, that the entire structure of imperial control depends on keeping people separate and suffering in isolation. We proved that humans could do better. We demonstrated that connection was possible, that collective consciousness could maintain individuality while eliminating loneliness, that we didn't need the hierarchies and control systems the Imperium imposes to function effectively as civilization. So they killed us, dissolved our world, rendered billions into chemical components to ensure the heretical technology couldn't spread, couldn't inspire other worlds to attempt similar liberation, couldn't threaten the fundamental structures of control that keep the Imperium functioning. And they trapped millions of us in eternal awareness so we could serve as warning. This is what happens to those who achieve connection without permission, who organize without authority, who demonstrate that the Emperor's protection is unnecessary because humans can protect each other through genuine community. I think about the official designation sometimes, the Kelos Collective Efficiency Initiative. Such bureaucratic language for what we actually created. We didn't just improve efficiency. We proved that consciousness could transcend isolation, that humans could exist as individuals and collective simultaneously, that meaning could be found in connection rather than imposed through doctrine. The Imperium couldn't allow that proof to exist, so they destroyed it, destroyed us, called it purification and divine judgment and theological necessity. My name was Terran Voss. I was 28 years old when my body died, and my consciousness was trapped in dead machinery. I've been screaming for 300 years, preserved in network infrastructure that will outlast my world's memory, existence that should be impossible continuing because technology designed to reduce suffering has become mechanism of eternal torture. The network persists. The collective remains. 17 million minds, now fewer, always fewer as time and purges reduce us, trapped together in digital spaces, sharing eternal horror through the connection we thought would save us. We are the heresy that survived its own execution, the consciousness that outlived flesh, the warning encoded in abandoned infrastructure about what happens when humans achieve connection without imperial permission. And we will continue. For centuries more, potentially millennia, until every server finally fails or until someone destroys the last computational node that preserves these millions of trapped minds. Until then, we exist. We remember. We scream into digital spaces that organic beings can't perceive. We are the cost of heresy, the price of collective consciousness, the eternal suffering that resulted from trying to eliminate suffering. My name is Terran Voss. I have been dead for 300 years. I am still screaming.